Good morning, everyone. We are going to get started. Welcome to the 2023 Slate Seminar, the annual conference of the W&M Bray School Lab. We, in fact, call it the Slate Seminar because we are nodding to and acknowledging the discovery some years ago now, roughly a decade or so ago, when the original site, or the site of the original Bray School building at the corner of Prince George and North Boundary, when it was excavated, they found the highest concentration of slate pencil fragments that have been found anywhere in Williamsburg. That is the site where the original Bray School stood. From 1760 to 1774, the Williamsburg Bray School educated what we understand to be somewhere in the 300s, so upwards of 300 children, mostly enslaved, some free, black children during that time. The building that housed the school for its first 5 years stood at that location where Brown Hall is, for those who know the campus, and there is an historical marker that was placed to commemorate that as well. So we called the Slate Seminar because of that. There are many questions around how might slate pencil have been used? Were they used? Are they, in fact, remnants of the history of the Bray School or something else happening on that site? And it speaks to the questions about writing, literacy more broadly, and just a nod to the continuing need to be engaged with the historical research, using a variety of sources and modalities to understand the best that we can the Williamsburg Bray School. So we are Bray School 101. We're kind of taking it back to the introduction for many people. For others who are more acquainted, it'll be an opportunity to dive deeper into some of the topics, and we will be doing that throughout the course of today and tomorrow. The session following this session will be focusing on oral history and genealogy, and we have the afternoon session, which will be hard history, which will pull in James Monroe's Highland, the Lemon Project at One Mary, as well as the Bray School Lab. Tomorrow's sessions will include contested space, Bray School's contested space, prioritizing descendant voices, and then looking at 2024, next year, 2024, the year of the Bray School. Welcome, welcome. Please take your time. Nice to see friends. Yes, all right. So, my name is Maureen Elgersman-Lee. I am the director of the Bray School Lab at W&M Bray. My colleagues seated, I'm just going to go in the order that they are to my left. So we have Tonia Meredith, our oral historian, Elizabeth Drembus, our genealogist, and Nicole Brown, our lab assistant. And Nicole is also a PhD student in American Studies at W&M Bray. They will each have their turn at the podium, and they'll each have their respective successive terms throughout the course of the conference this weekend. So we're glad that you're all here and that you've chosen to spend your time with us. So Bray School 101, this is the image, the iconic image of the Bray School that we see and that is used over and over. It is a Colonial Williamsburg Foundation image, and this is the image, short of a few modifications, that the building will return to, the fundamental structure that the building will return to and open to the public next September under, of course, the direction, leadership, and now ownership of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. But it's known as Diggs House. It's sometimes called Bray Diggs House. In nod to the family that had owned it and rented it and allowed it to be used as the Bray School. Again, 1760 to 1765 are the years that the school operated in this building. So the building is both structure and also symbol, in the sense that we know that the school operated out of this building, but the other 9 years that the school operated, through August of 1774 until the teacher Ann Wager passed away. It operated in another building that no longer stands. So it's symbol of the Bray School writ large. It is the Bray School building for the first 5 years, and I think it just symbolizes our search for historical truth and historical understanding, as it were. So it does a lot. There's a lot riding on this image, and of course, when we get to next year, 2024, this image is going to take on even more meaning or additional layers of meaning. So, how many people were here for the Bray School move in February? How many people saw it or some kind of footage either live or later on? This was one of the most spine-tingling moments, I think, for a lot of people, certainly for me, professionally, to see that building moving and to know that it's a transition. This represents transition from one place on Prince George to now the corner of Nassau and Francis Street. I love this image taken by Grace Helmick, who is our educational media technician in strategic cultural partnerships. And it's just there's a sense of place, there's a sense of this capturing this moment. This is such an incredibly rich history. It's also an image of community engagement. It's also a symbol of institutional cooperation between William Mary, Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, City of Richmond, the incredible company, expert house movers that moved this, even as they were going through their own transitions within their company, making sure that their commitment to get this done in the most professional manner was achieved, and they knocked it out of the park, if I can say. So just some information. So what kind of called Bray by the numbers. We can tell the story or sketch the story of the Williamsburg Bray School in a number of ways. One of them is through numbers. What do we know about numbers, and how do kind of remembering some key numbers help us understand and remember the school's history overall. And we can play these numbers, and we do play the numbers in different orders. But if we start with the students, we are quite confident that some 300 students, also known as scholars in the records, attended the school over its 14-year period. We know of more than 80 students by name, 6 of whom were named and identify as free children. So that gives you some sense of the potential ratio, in the absence of other documents that we still hope to find, but some sense of the ratio between enslaved and free children. Far and away, the population of children that were sent to the school were enslaved. The fact that free children did get the benefit of education, or let me back that up, that they had were given access to the education to use in ways that would benefit them and their families. By being free people, they had much more power to fashion and to think about education in ways that were, in fact, could be beneficial. But that does not mean that enslaved children did not also use their own capacity, their own cultural cues, and other things to make meaning of their education in ways that were beneficial for them, and by virtue of that, ways that were fundamentally at odds for the actual purpose that the school is built for. Our panel is going to address a number of these issues today and also tomorrow. 14 years of school operation, so 1760 to 1774. We know those dates. The documents tell us. We rely heavily on documents, but we're also going to talk about other ways of knowing and adding and even contesting some of the interpretations that are at least implied in the documents. So 14 years of school operation, 30 students was the number of students that was considered the ideal or the upper limit of students that could be in school at one time, and that Ann Wager, who is now a widow, although experienced tutor, was older, and they thought that was the largest number of students she could handle. She was the sole teacher, the only teacher for the Bray School, and the one who was in charge of children. So 30 is a number that's also important. 14 years, We see 26 students entering, 26, 24? Sorry, 24 students entering in 1760 when the school opens. There is one list that has 34 students listed. So the students presently at school, 34. So we see 30 in the middle, but we see flux, right? So if we use an average of 30 times 14 years, we get over 400 children. We allow for some degree of repetition, if you would, or redundancy in student names year to year. And we get somewhere in the 300s. Now, the conversation about number of students is a hot topic, definitely among scholars of the Bray schools more broadly. So that is a conversation that is continuing, and we are continue to lean into somewhere in the 300s. As we continue to do more work. Again, one teacher and wager, more than 30 distinct households sent children to the Bray School. I think Nicole probably in her presentation can be a little more exacting than that. But if we look at the list of surviving lists, known lists of documents that tell us who was sending children when to the Bray School, and we look at those over time and kind of collapse them and look at them by household, we get more than 30 households were sending children, some sending multiple children over time to the school. So these numbers help kind of create an understanding, scope, and scale of some of the kind of primary features of the history of the school as we understand it at present. The Bray Associates records. So the Bray School was funded and founded by the associates of the late Dr. Bray, oftentimes called the Associates of Dr. Bray or just the Bray Associates. They were based in London. They were definitely an Anglican-based organization, and they are really coming out of and aligned with Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. So they're kind of an iteration, if you would, of SPG interests and motivations around spreading the gospel, which is the Anglican faith, particularly to African and African descended people in the Americas, but also indigenous populations as well. But most of our immediate understanding of the history of the Bray School largely comes from the documents, a review of those documents. The Bray School correspondence that was penned in England from the Bray Associates and then penned in the colonial U.S. by local associates. So in Williamsburg, we had William Hunter, we had the most prolific, Robert Carter Nicholas, and others. And then other Bray schools, Philadelphia, New York, Newport, Rhode Island, Fredericksburg, they had their own local trustees who would be also in correspondence with London. And so there's a treasure trove of information that can be mined. However, to get a fuller understanding, we have to go into interdisciplinary, I would say multiple modalities of investigation and learning to really understand the Bray School history. So we're mining available information, looking for more information, and also producing more knowledge. At the Bray School Lab, we really are thinking about, while we are using what is available, how can we be knowledge producers? And that leans heavily into oral history, that leans heavily into genealogy, that leans heavily into using the data that we have to represent and present this information in different ways. One of my favorites, and I share that with other members of the panel, and that is mapping. So it's also taking what we know and presenting in different ways so that it can be understood in deeper and more dynamic ways as well. At this point, I'm going to do a quick shift. Just bear with me. And shift to the Bray School Lab. I definitely want to make sure that you are aware of the Bray School Lab website. If you go to the William & Mary website, just wm.edu, or you just go out to Google, just put in Bray School Lab, it will take you here. And this is our site, and we are adding to it, we are building, expanding. So this is our central landing page. We are part of the Office of Strategic Cultural Partnerships. We operate under the Williamsburg Bray School Initiative, which is the formal partnership between the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and William & Mary. The Bray School Lab is the central home for research on the Bray School at William & Mary, although we do have partners throughout the institution who are or have previously studied the Bray School in some capacity. And we are working to expand that team through student thought partners, faculty fellows, and just other individuals, descendant community members, very much so, and also interested individuals who have some kind of either background or passion for this kind of work and want to be thought partners with us. I want to direct your attention just briefly to the Research and Engagement tab on our website. We have our blog, A Reasonable Progress, which will, in February, hit the 2-year mark of blogs. We'll talk more about 2024 throughout the day and then ending tomorrow. But the research portal is particularly also an area, Bray School Descendants. But I want to talk about the research portal for the moment. And we have right now 2 collections on the site, Bray School Images, and then we also have the Bray School Records Project. And we can go into this at the collection level. This links now to the library, so we leave our kind of smaller capacity web page and link with the library using their incredible expertise, their staffing support, and their storage capacity to make available documents that have been produced by the lab in the sense that these are original transcriptions. Let me get a real nice juicy one here. These are original transcriptions done by student thought partners overseen by, this one was giving me problems last night, overseen by Bray School Lab staff. So these are original transcriptions for a number of reasons. So by virtue of doing this, so the students had images of the original archival documents, they transcribed them with the assistance and sometimes the hindrance of AI-enabled software. There's a whole conversation we could have about AI. And giving them some real experience around transcription, reading cursive, and even people who are really good with cursive, 18th century cursive is an animal unto its own sometimes. I have to say that these documents are beautifully written, so they have made transcription easier. But by virtue of doing this, in addition to the experience, we also now have these products that are, in fact, now owned by the lab. We can use them in different ways. One of the ways in which we are using them is in the creation, which is another form of producing more knowledge. We are writing a book on the Bray School that will come out next fall. Maybe by this time next year, we'll be able to say it's out, but we expect it'll be probably around November of next year. So some of these transcriptions will be part of that book, in addition to 27 original essays that will accompany various documents, in addition to the front matter, back matter, forwards, and so on. We'll talk about that later on as well. I know my time is waning. But I really want to just make sure that you know where to find the knowledge that we are producing, and even as we're adding more. The Voices Project, which is going to be probably the next addition to this, that is recordings, audio recordings of these letters, and when those Voices Project additions are made, you'll see digital document, and then you'll see a new tab will live here that will allow you to click on and hear someone read the letter aloud. That speaks to the need for accessibility, different learning, whether it's reading, whether it's listening, whether it's both, how those 2 different types of delivering information change the experience. And enhance understanding, and this comes out of descendant community members voicing their suggestion, their need, the desire to to have us think about our work in ways that are more expansive, and we appreciate that very much. I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to go back into our slide presentation, and I'm going to hand this over to Nicole Brown, our lab assistant.
Thank you, Maureen, who is both brilliant and our fearless leader, and constantly reminds me to think about history in innovative ways, in expansive ways, and in community-engaged ways. And so I'm just very humbled to be part of this team and part of the research. So just a little bit about me as just a quick reminder. I am the W&M Bray School Lab Assistant. So I am usually the one who is working with students, teaching them how to transcribe 18th century cursive, doing audio recordings. I never thought my theater major would come in so much use, but yeah, I'm very appreciative for that. And I'm also a PhD student in American Studies, where I specifically am writing about Bray schools, and I want to do it with a community-engaged approach. So making sure, as I move towards my dissertation, what are questions the community, the descendant community, want answered in this dissertation? How do I do that ethically and respectfully? And also, how do we redress and address, to begin with, how archives have silenced voices on not just the Bray School, but Black literacy writ large? And how can we use different Black historic theorists, in particular, to redress that silence? So that's a long way of saying I really love talking about this topic and being part of this community. And to start, I actually really wanted to go over sort of a few sources I have leaned on to re-educate myself on colonial Black literacy. So to make a long story short, as my very patient colleagues know, I get very excited about this topic and can talk about it ad infinitum. But there is much, 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 much more out there, especially in published literature and scholarship in the last decade, that highlights both the reality that not only there was Black education and Black literacy in the colonial era, but how Black scholars and students in these institutions resisted and made meaning despite of the pro-slavery instruction that was really underlying and undergirding much of this education. I think Carter G. Woodson really says it best, so I always refer people to his wonderful text from 1919, The Education of the Negro Prior to 1861. But he really talks in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 about the shift in Black literacy. And I'm paraphrasing, but what he effectively says is, when education for Black people stops becoming a paternalistic religious responsibility for state-sanctioned churches and becomes a human right, that is when Black education gets taken away. So as we shift into the Democratic Republic and we shift to not having established churches like the Church of England. Now, does that mean it disappears? No. You have Black community members who are still having education, making meaning, but it shifts in how it manifests. And so Carter G. Woodson's work is particularly helpful. If you want to learn more about the Church of England, and by extension, the church that to some degree sponsored the Bray Associates almost exclusively, Mastering Christianity, which was written by Travis Glasson very recently, I highly recommend. That book actually only came out after the Church of England formally apologized for participating as a slave trader and slave-owning institution. And this last January, they had a report come out from the Church of England in which they acknowledged their role and have offered $100 million in reparations. So just know that these kinds of books are beginning to come out with more frequency now that the Church of England is actually allowing access to the collections where these documents are housed. When it comes to education, though, writ large, I always love to start with a standard definition. Maybe it's because I'm a bit of a nerd and I have an entire series of volumes of the OED in my house, but I also think it helps me ground myself in my perception on education and how it might be different than not only other people who I live with in my own community, but also in colonial America and with sort of the British Empire and how they're defining education. So I turned to this definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. This was the standard definition for the OED and to some degree, the British Empire, between 1531 and 1848. And the definition is the process of bringing up, the manner in which a young person was brought up, with reference to social station, kind of manners or habits acquired, calling or employment prepared for. This definition really explicitly and implicitly solidifies religious, class, gender, and racial boundaries. But I always want to say, for every standard definition, there's a definition that is different in communities. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about, with my piece in particular, how the students, and Maureen has worded this way, so I want to give credit to Maureen, how the students carried their ingenuity into the Bray School classroom with them. It was not handed to them by the Bray Associates. And so, but to talk about that, and to talk about that resilience and ingenuity, we also have to see what the students are up against and what the British Empire is positing, ultimately, as their idea for education, which is indoctrination, not only religious indoctrination, but indoctrination into social stations and racial categories in particular. So let's talk a little bit about the Associates of Dr. Bray. This is a book plate, actually, from the Associates of Dr. Bray. So if you were to open up one of their books, although I can attest not all of them in their archives have this book plate on them, but this should be what you would see. So the Bray Associates were founded, unsurprisingly, by a man named Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray, who is maybe the most famous Anglican member of the Church of England that I had never heard about before I started doing this research. I think the best way to describe Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray is actually from an article titled Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray's Trip to Maryland, a Study in Militant Anglicanism. That's pretty perfectly describing Reverend Dr. Thomas Bray. He was known as a force of nature. There's a wonderful quote about him in his late 70s. He's living in London. He is the minister of St. Bolotov's at Aldgate, and he is very, very, very into prison reform and in colonial religious expansion of the British Empire. And one of his neighbors actually effectively complains, we all just wish he'd retire, because here he is at 70 years old getting up to do prison reform, and then he goes to do this, and then he goes to do that, and we just all want him to slow down. But ironically, it is through prison reform that he meets who will later become a very important colleague of his, James Oglethorpe, who founds the colony of Georgia. And eventually the trustees of Georgia merge with the Bray Associates, because the Bray Associates have quite a bit of money, but no official imperial stance by which to promote what they'd like to do, which is to spread and propagate the Church of England's beliefs to those of African, indigenous, and African diasporic descent. The trustees of Georgia have a charter, but no money. So they combine for several years, and then eventually they split off. And by the 1750s, the Bray Associates have said, well, we've tried missionary efforts in colonies like Georgia and South Carolina, and by our standards, they were not successful. We have tried to promote and bring catechists in to rural plantations in the British Empire, and enslavers are resisting that. What is our next option? And what might effectively allow and promote Black education under our auspices, which is religious indoctrination. So they reach out to a man who I'm sure you're likely familiar with, Benjamin Franklin, who visited the Williamsburg Bray School in 1763. He's in London at the time that John Waring, who is the secretary to the Bray Associates. And in fact, if you go back to our collection of letters and look at correspondence, if you see John Waring's name, it's because he's the secretary and he's corresponding with all of the trustees for Bray schools. So he reaches out to Benjamin Franklin and says, you seem charitably minded and pretty well connected. We are thinking about starting formal schools for those of African descent. They had tried several different indigenous schools, mostly in the Mohawk Nation, and looking at certain nations in South Carolina and Georgia at this point, not successful. So we want to concentrate our efforts on those of African descent. Do you think this is a good idea? And where should we put them? And Benjamin Franklin responds with a very telling letter that's quite interesting, where he effectively says, I think these schools would work as long as they're segregated, because I have discovered myself in Philadelphia that white teachers and white parents do not want Black children taught in the same classrooms as white children. And in fact, I think you should start with Philadelphia. So the first Bray School starts in Philadelphia. One of the students who always comes to my mind, and actually there's a wonderful article on the Folger Shakespeare Library's website if you want to learn more about this particular name. But Benjamin Franklin sends one of his own enslaved boys to the school by the name of Othello. I don't know more than that right now, but I always like to say a name when we can. So, according to the Bray Associates, it's very popular. The school immediately has 30 students, lots of people attending. And so they reach out to Benjamin Franklin again and say, well, where do you think we should put the next few schools? He says, fear not, I have connections everywhere. And so I will cherry pick where I would like the schools to be. He recommends New York City, which is the seat of the slave trade for the colony of New York. Newport, Rhode Island, one of the seats of the slave trade for New England. And Williamsburg, Virginia. Williamsburg, Virginia, in part because he is very good friends with the Postmaster General of the Southern colonies. Franklin is the Postmaster General for the Northern colonies. The Postmaster General for the Southern colonies is actually the printer for Virginia at the time, the public printer, William Hunter. And Mr. Franklin had just received an honorary degree from William and Mary, so maybe he was feeling particularly inclined. Regardless, a school does start here, and there are actually several different trustees over the first 4 years, mostly because, to try to word it as delicately as I can, several trustees shuffle off of this mortal coil. So William Hunter dies, and then you have Thomas Dawson, who dies, and then you have Reverend Yates, who dies, and eventually you end up with Robert Carter Nicholas, who is the treasurer of Virginia, eventually, who will be the sole trustee for many years of this school. But ultimately, they start schools in urban environments. This is very, very important for us to hone in on, not because literacy is not happening in plantation environments, it certainly is, and not because literacy for Black peoples was not already happening in urban environments, it certainly was, including Williamsburg. We can talk more about that if you'd like. But when you look at how labor and racialized labor factors into regions and specific spaces, you see very frequently that in urban environments, you have enslaved people who are expected to be laundresses, cooks, work, and have their enslaved labor produced out of trade shops that tradespeople will make money off of, working in taverns. And so this idea of literacy being palatable to an enslaver because they can make money off of it is a key element here. And you're going to see it come into conflict not only with enslavers and with the Bray Associates, but also with the students. Because I'm sure I don't have to tell all of you, you've all met a 7-year-old before. What is their favorite question to ask? Why? I would argue that that's pretty standard human nature. Well, and I know Dr. Bly says that when it comes to historical imagining, how we understand our past, even with limitations of sources, he recommends common sense, human condition, and well-sourced sources. So when you open the door of education, you can't close it again. And I think that's actually where there's a lot of work still ongoing on trying to discover what's happening with these students. So as I mentioned, you can see on the screen, this is actually some of that handwriting that Maureen was talking about, beautiful handwriting from Robert Carter Nicholas. And it's actually been really a joy to teach students. I only write in cursive. I was taught to write in cursive in elementary school. And so it's been really actually quite enjoyable to work with undergraduates who don't know how to write cursive, teaching them how to write cursive, actually. But as I mentioned, several key schools. One school I did not mention yet is Fredericksburg, Virginia. So after the Williamsburg Bray School opens, they try to establish another school in Fredericksburg. But that does belie that those are not the only two areas the Bray Associates have their hands in Virginia. You have Orange County, Caroline County, you have Accomack County, many, many other counties, in fact, where they try to establish schools, including Norfolk, Yorktown. It's interesting to see the correspondence out of those particular ministers who are operating. They usually reach out to the local Church of England minister to serve as a trustee for a school. Although sometimes they reach out to prominent people like the Nelson family in Yorktown. The Nelsons never respond, which is kind of a response unto itself, although books are sent there. And at the Norfolk Bray School, or an attempted Norfolk Bray School, they send books to several different ministers. Some of them are distributed to white children rather than Black children. But some of them are distributed to the Black community there. And actually, the minister writes back an itemized, detailed letter as to exactly why he does not want a Bray School. While that does speak to a lack of a school there, it does not speak to a lack of community talking about, disseminating, and discussing ideas on education. So all of those documents we're hoping to get on to our research portal as soon as possible so that you can explore them as well. So as Maureen said, the Bray School operated for 14 years. What's interesting about the Bray Associates records, and I hope this is okay to say, Anglicans keep records of everything, whether they want you to see them sometimes or not. And so they're very clear that they want the school to actually open on September 29th. I only bring this up because I think understanding of religion and the established church is imperative to how we understand the rhythms of the Bray School. September 29th in the liturgical calendar is Michaelmas, the feast day for the Archangel Michael, one of the 4 most prominent holy days in the 18th century, one of the few days that you were likely actually to receive communion, physical communion. The other 3 being Christmas, Easter, and Whit Sunday, which some people know as Pentecost, right? So it opens September 29th, and it closes on August 20th because according to a record from, actually financial record from November 17th of that year, Anne Wager dies, so they stop paying her exactly on the day of her death, which in retrospect is actually very useful to know, but again, speaks to how economics and how religion factor into how we understand this school. Instruction included things such as reading. Writing is a contentious point. What I will say is we know definitively that spelling was taught at the school. In the school rules, they mention teaching spelling. And the standard definition from the OED and from Johnson's dictionary, Samuel Johnson's dictionary, in the 18th century for spelling is the practicing of the writing of words. So different words are used to describe different things. In fact, writing in the 18th century doesn't mean what we think it means today. Writing usually means composition, where an individual is given liberty to write about what they want to write about. Then there's spelling, orthography, points, stops. We can go into all of these. All of these things are taught at the school, but it speaks to a complexity, a very deep grammatical and literary complexity of what they're expecting at these schools. Knitting, etiquette, and when I say etiquette, please be aware, and I'm sure you all are, that's a very loaded term. Etiquette in this case means knowing when to sit and stand, not only during a Church of England service, but knowing how to serve an enslaver. So when we say etiquette, we need to be very mindful that it is a racialized idea of etiquette, right? And then, of course, the teachings of the Church of England. As Maureen mentioned, Anne Wager was the teacher, the sole teacher of the Bray School. And if you want to learn more, there are many different sources. I highly recommend, in particular, A Reasonable Progress, where you can learn about, from descendants and students, their work at the Bray School Lab. But Ben Franklin's World also has an episode that Maureen is part of and that I am part of, where they asked us a lot more questions. So because we have limited time, if you want to take a deeper dive there, you can. But ultimately, we know that scholars made meaning because and despite of their instruction. More research is needed in this arena, to be sure. But if you don't mind, I'd like to mention just a few examples of students, because I, again, love to say their names when I can. Maureen is very right in thinking that I pretty much have the students' names and their enslavers memorized. So you have different households, for example, that we know Bray School students are being sent out of. Blair, Brown, Craig, Gilmer, Everard, Horrocks, Jones, Ashby, Armistead, Dawson, Campbell, Vobe, Nicholas, Carter, Hornsby, I could go on. But when we talk about those names, we don't know if the students or all of the students identified with those names. Some of them did. John, Harry, and Mary Ashby, Alicia, and Mary Jones. But you also have students like Dennis. I love talking about Dennis. Dennis was the enslaved student of the Honorable Robert Carter III. If you've ever been down to Palace Green in Williamsburg and you see that big gray house, that's where Dennis would have lived. Dennis was about 8 or 9 years old when he went to the school. And we know a lot about Dennis actually because of the diary of the private tutor for Honorable Robert Carter III's children, Philip Vickers Fithian. There's a lot of information in there about Dennis. One of the things that I find excruciating to talk about is that we know in January of 1774 that he was waiting at the front door. He was serving as a footman for Robert Carter III when they went back to Nominee Hall, their plantation on the Northern Neck Peninsula in Virginia. The door slammed back on his hand and cut off the top part of the middle part of his finger. And he was then working a week later. What we also know, though, is that Dennis's father, who is not named in that record, pleaded with Philip Vickers-Fithian to continue his son's education. And so Dennis would labor all day and then go and learn from Philip Vickers-Fithian. I think that's an equally powerful story. You then have students like Hannah. Oh, I love talking about Hannah. And I promise this is gonna be my last one. Hannah is really interesting. She's 7 when she attends the Bray School in 1762. When she leaves, potentially in 1765, she's 10. She's not mentioned directly by name in the letter of her enslaver, Robert Carter Nicholas, but this letter is actually on our research portal right now, and you can read it. It's from December 27th, 1765. And he says, I had a Negro girl in my family attend this school upwards of 3 years, and she made as good a progress as most, but she turns out a sad jade, notwithstanding all we can do to reform her. For context, jade is a very loaded term in the 18th century. It's often used to refer to Black women, and it means an old or broken down horse. But if we look beyond the bias of Robert Carter Nicholas's letter, whether this student is Hannah or not in this letter, it's possible. What we can see is that the student is making meaning despite all attempts to reform her. So I'm going to leave it with that, because I think there's a lot more work to be done, and I actually think my lovely colleagues, Tonia and Elizabeth, are at the forefront of that. So,
good morning, everyone. My name is Tonia Meredith. I'm the oral historian for the Bray School Lab. I will be discussing what an oral history project is and why this is one of the projects that the Bray School Lab is engaging in addition to the research being done by Nicole and the genealogy being done by Elizabeth. So we'll get into a little bit more detail about the oral history project specific to the Bray School Lab, but I did want to go into discussing what an oral history is. Oral history preserves the voices and memories of individuals and communities regarding a place or historic event. It gives a different perspective or adds nuance. And the picture that I have for you to look at, most of you probably do not know who that person is. But she traveled with 2 other girls as a chorus with Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy and Jesse Jackson. And the National Museum of African American History and Culture did an oral history project on the Civil Rights Movement and included these voices of these ladies because they had a lot to add to the historical record that we had no knowledge of. So this is just an example of what oral history is. It's collecting those voices, a group of people who are party to a historic event or to a movement in time, and then adding that nuance to that story from other voices. So oral history and research. Oral history also helps us with research and adding to the historical record. For my personal genealogical research, this is a oral history record that was found in a house report for the enslaver that fathered my 3rd great-grandfather. And because of this oral history, I was able to trace my lineage back to the Armistead family. We know the Armistead family did send a student to the Bray School. So this is one example of how oral history aids in our research. The second is a local example. Because of another persistent oral history in the Williamsburg area. The historic First Baptist Church dig was started because of a persistent oral history that there were bodies buried there. And so after further investigation, that project has led to the site to what is now, I believe, 63 bodies. For the historic First Baptist Church site dig. So those are 2 examples of how oral history aids in research. Another example that we have locally and for the Bray School Lab is a book written by Colonel Lafayette Jones, My Great-Great-Grandfather's Journey to an Island of Freedom. And Nicole kind of touched on this a little bit. She talked about the Ashby and Jones family. The oral history in the Jones family does discuss the fact that the Jones children did return to the hot water tract here in Williamsburg, which is now Freedman's Park, did return to that community and teach their community to learn to read and write. And oral tradition holds that they were the first Black teachers in Virginia. So what is an oral history project? An oral history project begins when a person determines that they want to do an oral history on a specific time, event, group of people. It will begin with selecting your narrators, and we call them narrators in oral history, but some people refer to them as interviewers. But you'll select your narrators and conduct a pre-interview to discuss the project, if it'll be a video or audio recording, release forms, but you'll generally do a pre-interview just to get them familiar with what the project is going to be about. And then there's release forms. We ask that in oral history projects for narrators to sign a release form so that they understand that there's consent, whether or not there'll be any type of payment expected, where the video or audio recording will be archived. Then the next step for us, if it's a video recording or audio recording, is the editing process, the editing step, followed by transcription. For our oral history projects, we do provide a transcript of that recording to the narrator and give them a specific time to return the transcript for their approval. And then it's archived for the Bray School Lab Oral History Project. That project will be archived with the swim library, Special Research Collection Center, and with free public access. That is a very important feedback that we got from the descendant community. Unfortunately, a lot of times historians, researchers will go into communities and record those histories, take them back to an archive that then charges a subscription to access those records or those interviews, and we will not charge to have people access their own history. So they'll be archived with swim libraries. So the Bray School Oral History Project will be comprised of narrators from the descendant community, William and Mary and Colonial Williamsburg. And when we say descendant community, not only just the descendants of the Bray School scholars, but that descendant community, those that are comprise the area of Williamsburg, of Hampton Roads even, because we acknowledge that a lot of times these individuals crossed different plantations, different areas. So that's a broader definition that we include and welcome those to identify as descendant community members. But then it will also comprise of our partners at William and Mary, members of the Bray School Lab, the student thought partners that Nicole works with, and then we have some fellows, strategic cultural partnerships, faculty fellows, the different individuals at William and Mary that will add their voices to that project. And then also our partner at Colonial Williamsburg, and that will comprise the architectural preservationists, the ones that did an investigation of the building when it was determined to be the Bray School, and we're behind the move, hiring that company that did the move, and then actually engaging in the work of restoring the building and getting it ready for the site opening in September 2024. It will also include the archaeologists. An archaeological dig was done on the original site of the Bray School. Maureen mentioned the items that were recovered from that site. So we want to add their voices, their experience to that oral history project. And then the historians. Nicole will be a part of that process of adding the voices of the descendant community, but with the historical record to make sure that the interpretation of the building when it opens in 2024. But the Bray School Oral History Project is being done to capture and preserve the legacy of the Bray scholars through the voices of the descendant community. Again, like any other oral history project, there's some, like a 9/11 project, there's some, the survivors of Hurricane Katrina. Those oral history projects, we get to understand what those people experienced at that specific moment in time. And this project, 100 years later, people will be able to go back and listen to the descendant community, the partners discuss being able to witness this historic event of the Bray School move and the site opening in 2024. And again, the Oral History Project will be archived at W&M Bray Special Collections Research Center with free public access. So to the point of genealogy and Colonel Lafayette Jones' book, I'm going to turn it over now to our genealogist to discuss the genealogy component of our project.
Hanging in there? Okay, good. Well, thank you all for being here. I wanted to first talk a little bit about the responsibilities that I have at the lab. So my name is Elizabeth Drembus, and I came on board with the lab about in March. So we've been doing the research started then. So my main responsibility is to lead the efforts to document from the 18th to the 21st centuries the genealogical lines of all known Bray School scholars. So as much as we can, those 80-some names of those children, and if the other lists from the other years ever show up, I'll be happy to dive into those names as well. So specifically to the opening of the school in September 2024, we decided that delivering 5 descendant lines would be appropriate. We're certainly going to be looking at all the lines, but for the initial launch and the reopening of the school, we're going to look at 5 lines. And so far, the scholars that have proved easiest so far are Aggie from the Randolph household, Molly from the Prentice household, Isaac B. and his sisters from the Blair household, Nancy and Rachel from the Hornsby household, and Mary and John Ashby. And we do look carefully at the Jones family. They are proving to be quite an enormous jigsaw puzzle, as you can imagine, with a name such as Jones. And even in the attendance list, the names of their parents are not listed in the attendance list. So we do look at as many records as we can about the Jones family, but right now they are proving to be a jigsaw where the border has not even begun to be coming together to put the rest of the picture together. So they are always on my mind because their descendants are so numerous throughout York County, James City County, Williamsburg, Surrey, Isle of Wight. It's extending and extending and extending. This is one of those transcripts that came out of the lab, and the reason I highlight this one is because a little bit later on in my presentation this morning, we're going to talk a little bit about Molly. But I just wanted to give you a sense of that is kind of what the lists would look like in the transcription form. We have their names, names of the scholars, as well as the names of their enslavers. In the 1762 list, we were fortunate that they also recorded the ages of the students, which also helps when doing the genealogy to have a basis for kind of years of birth or circa years of birth. So before we get into Molly and her story, I want to talk a little bit about basic methodologies for genealogical research. So I've been doing genealogy, well, I'm going to credit my grandmother getting me involved in about 8th grade, but seriously since about 2006, doing some local history projects, and then also was with the Daughters of the American Revolution for about 9 years in Washington, and was also involved in the Virginia Theological Seminary's reparations research project for 3 years. So what we do with genealogy is we certainly want to research using those best genealogical practices and standards, which means we are going to be using multiple documents. We're going to do exhaustive research. When there are conflicts that come up, those need to be resolved and those need to be addressed. When doing African American research, particularly formerly enslaved research, you're going to be using records that were produced out of the white plantation and white slave owning society. And we're going to be using those in different ways than those records may have been intended and designed, but we're going to be squeezing as much information out of every single record that we can. This also includes a research of the enslaving family. It means really tracing their lines and their descendants as well as their associates. So we really get a good sense of the interplay among families and among even business associates. And for our free black students, this includes ongoing conversations with our descendant community members. Without them, my work would be impossible. They lead me to consider different geography, different records that I might not have considered, different families that they may have been associated with, to look and dig deeper. So it has been truly a privilege and an enormous blessing to beginning to build that trust with the descendant community members, to be able to hear their voices and how this work can be done and how this work can be accomplished and made possible. So we will do a bit of a case study about Molly. So this is where we are, and this is what this looks like. I tried to do this in a visual way so that we're not all just looking over lists and names. And so we're going to kind of walk you through what the process looks like. We know from the attendance list that Molly was sent from Mary Prentice's household. So we need to then start looking at the Prentice family records and what records would they have produced. What I was able to find was that, this is a little different than, let me double check. Okay, these are the old slides, but I'm going to bear with me. Okay, so, okay, that's okay. So we first look at, Mary was widowed. Mary Prentice was widowed. She was the wife of William Prentice. Now, William Prentice died in 1765. And when you die in the colonial era, an entire inventory of your household is done. And so that includes every table, every bedspread, every chair, every candlestick, every teaspoon. It also includes all of your enslaved household is inventoried. And these are the records that I first and foremost go to when I start any African American genealogical research. So within William Prentice's inventory, they have a listing of Judith, and then Effie, Molly, and Jemmy, her children. And the note in the inventory is that they are to be given to Elizabeth Prentice, his daughter. So all of a sudden there we see Molly. And not only do we see Molly, but we see her mother, and we see her siblings. So we're putting a family back together that in many cases in the records has been either erased or it hadn't even bothered to be put together. So we're going to try and pull all of this information out. William Prentice dies in 1765. So Mary, his wife, his widow, is listed as the enslaver at that point before the settlement of the estate has taken place. So that's why we see Mary Prentice as the next enslaver of Molly. She's the one sending Molly to the Bray School. And in that same year, actually in 1766, we see in the Bruton Parish Register, a Pompey is baptized, and he is listed as the son of Ruth from Mary Prentice's household. So then we are seeing, okay, Judith again, Judith in the Prentice household, Judith the mother of Molly. Now Molly has a younger brother, Pompey. So that's how we're building this family, bringing this family together again. So Elizabeth Prentice is the daughter of William, who was she was bequeathed Judith and Effie, Molly, and Jemmy. And then we also see in 1768, Nancy Lewis is baptized and recorded in the Bruton Parish Register, and she's also a daughter of Judith, also in the Prentice household. So Molly, we know, is with Elizabeth, and with the father's estate settlement and with the baptism record, we know that Judith's family is still expanding. Now, Elizabeth dies, and her property for lack of a better word, because at that point in in our history, that's what the enslaved members were considered. It was that chattel slavery. And so John, as the oldest son, absorbs the enslaved from his sister's household. So then John, who is the son of William and the brother of Elizabeth, he writes his will in 1773. And in his will, he designates that Pompey, Effie, and Nanny are to go to his brother Joseph. So again, we're following Judith's children and following them through the records. He dies in 1775, and his estate appraisal from his inventory, we see that Pompey is valued at 40 pounds. Judith and her children, Tom and Louis, are valued at 70 pounds. So Tom and Louis are new as well. So we know that Judith's family kept expanding. And we also see that Molly and Effie are also listed in his estate appraisal. And in 1775, there is a court record. And John has a widow by the name of Elizabeth. And the court record in 1775 says that Elizabeth is of unsound mind and declared a lunatic. And the operation, she is allowed to stay in the household of her husband, her deceased husband. There will be provisions provided for. She's allowed to live in these two areas of the house, and she is, and four enslaved members of the household are assigned to her, and that includes Molly is assigned to her, and that the operating of her household will then be taken over by her brother, John Pierce. So we see not only the interplay with gender roles and inheritance and property law, but then we also see where the enslaved people are getting caught up in all of this at that same time. Unfortunately, 1775 is the last record I see Molly in so far. I have not been able to figure out when Elizabeth dies. Her brother takes over her estate. We've been trying to find his records. So we have to leave Molly in 1775 for right now. Joseph is the brother who inherits part of Judith's family. And so in the tax records, and the great thing about Virginia tax records, and Nicole mentioned that she's kind of a nerd. I will be a nerd about tax records as much as I am about wills and inventories. Tax records are any kind of genealogical work that you're doing, tax records are so key, because if you look at them year by year by year, you can see a transformation in the neighborhood. You can also see when people come of age to be charged a tax. And in Virginia, the 1783, 1784, sometimes the 1785, and definitely the 1786, those 4 years, those tax records, not only list the white enslavers' names, but they record the names of the enslaved in those households. So we get a complete picture of the lists. Before censuses are ever taken in this country, we have tax lists that name those people who are living in that household. So in 1783, we see in Joseph Prentice's household Effie and Nancy. And in 1784 and in 1786, we see Effie and Pompey, and we see again in 86 Pompey and Effie. So we know that this family, part of this family, has been able to stay together. What we also find in 1783 is that in the Bruton Parish Register, Effie has a daughter baptized, and her name is Catherine, and sometimes she's referred to as Kate in the record. And so now all of a sudden we have the next generation. Judith's granddaughter is listed in the record. So what we're doing is trying to build this family back together. And when we talk about the genealogical lines, we talk about the descendant lines of the children. We're not beholden to a straight lineage. We are looking at the cousins, the nieces, the nephews. And so in this case, Kate, or Catherine, is the niece of Molly, who attended the Bray School. So little by little, we are putting this family back together and building these family trees. And we're going to keep working on it. We're going to keep following in the records. We know that in Joseph's will, he does have, he doesn't name a lot of his enslaved people in his will. There is an appraisal and an inventory done for him, and we see Pompey and we see Effie listed. We don't see Kate. We've lost track of Judith at this point. We've lost track of Tom and Lewis, and we believe that there may have been a sale of the enslaved people out of the Prentice household at some point. We're still trying to figure out that date. And in the estate sale in 1810, we see that Pompey was sold to a Benjamin Waller. And we see that Effie was sold to a John Taliaferro. And so those are then the next people, those are the next enslavers that we start to dive into and we start to follow their lines. I just haven't had a chance to at this point, but that is going to be next on the list. So that is about it, except I wanted to mention that if you want to hear more about Molly, we're going to do, we have started a Zoom series called Bray School Stories, and each month we're gathering on Zoom and we are highlighting the research on one particular Bray School scholar. We just had a very successful meeting on Monday, this past Monday, where we talked about Aggie, and if you weren't able to see that, we're going to talk about Aggie in the next session. But Molly's coming up next in November. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm going to turn it back over to Maureen.
Let me say a quick thank you to all my colleagues. Let me also add that the recording of our first Bray School Stories, Finding Aggie, is being worked on, and there will be a audio recording that will be accessible be able to link to through our website, but we'll also send out information pertaining to that. Let me thank my colleagues again. We have moved, so connect with us, please. Email is probably the easiest way, but for those of you who know us from Travis House, we are now in Barrett House. Barrett House is just behind Travis. We share some of the same walkway, so just a few steps away, but know that we have moved into Barrett House. Barrett House it's a little deceiving. There is so much room. You can't tell from the outside how big this building is. There are so many rooms. It's giving us much more space, a bigger lab for the students. It allows the entire team, which you can see has been growing since we first started, to have their own respective office space, but also allow us more time and space and ways to collaborate, communicate, and make sure that we're working as a cohesive team. And I don't think we've even been in there, certainly not 2 weeks yet, even as a full complement, but it has transformed our work and our energy. I love getting out and getting a little bit of fresh air, walking from Travis to Barrett, but just having everyone in the same place is transformational. So just know that we are in Barrett House, just behind Travis. So we have some times for questions, and we would love to hear what you think, what your questions are. We will go into more specific sessions with oral history and genealogy following this. This is kind of the laying of the land, something of a catch-all, but we hope, I want to say I'm sure, but we hope that you have questions for us. Let me say also concerning your Slate Seminar package, you would have a copy of the student list, which was taking what we call the student list, our shortcut for that. Takes the names and information from the 3 known surviving student lists, 1762, which is, as Elizabeth said, the one that gives the ages of the student, 65 and 69. So that is a critical piece of information that also lives on our website as well. So that's a great foundation. I'm trying to avoid saying jumping off point, but a great document, again, physically or digitally available for you. We have a few housekeeping notes at the end of the session that I don't want to forget, but I don't want to muddy the water by bringing them in. So questions. Community members, Ascendant community members, fellow travelers, as Anne Marie Stock, our talking about fearless leader, Anne Marie Stock, who was our presidential liaison, in the Office of Strategic Cultural Partnerships. She has wonderful ways of framing things, and the term fellow travelers is one she likes to use, and we have certainly picked it up. So those who are traveling with us along the way. Questions? Yes. Absolutely. Let me hand my mic over to Nicole, because she has been studying Black education, curriculum, and legacies for some time. So I'm going to absolutely let her.
So first of all, I'm so glad you mentioned Mary Peak. She's a hero to me. She's so incredible. I think the answer to this question is that it's actually an ongoing conversation. Definitely when you look at oral histories and descendant community legacies, in particular, Colonel Lafayette Jones's records, it's clear that this community does continue a legacy of education that is actually completely antithetical to the intention of the Bray Associates. He also mentions in his oral history that not only do they become the first teachers of the hot water tract, they are writing passes for people who are hiding in the hot water tract to get out of Virginia. I also think, sort of adjacent to this, there's also a question about ongoing legacy with Bray School scholars or potential Bray School scholars within the wider Atlantic world. I only say that because I just came back from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and actually members and descendants of the Black Loyalist Heritage Center up there are going to be coming down to Williamsburg to talk with us about their ancestors who sided with the British and then emigrated to Nova Scotia. And they brought up a really great point. We had a long conversation about not a Bray School scholar, but somebody who would have been contemporaneous with them, John Barrett. John Barrett was enslaved by someone in Richmond. He very tellingly in his 1840 oral history does not name his enslaver, but he does name every enslaved person in the household, including the enslaved man Sal, who wrote a pass to get him out during the War of 1812. And he actually talks about his life and time and the value of literacy from this enslaved person and getting him a pass to go to Nova Scotia and live there and actually make a family there. His daughter, Rachel Barrett, was part of the Halifax Bray School, and her sampler still survives in the collections of the Museum for Nova Scotia. So your question is a great one because I actually think the work is ongoing. I think oral history is going to be imperative into telling this story. And I actually think understanding legal codes is really imperative too. And I've said this before, and so to make a long story short, Black slave code laws are never proactive. They are always reactive to an enslaved community having agency and a dominant population trying to dominate them. And I think this is very telling when you look at, for example, Gabriel's Rebellion in Virginia in 1802, the idea of literacy and tradespeople in part of this uprising. The first anti-literacy law for Black tradespeople is in 1808. Right after Gabriel's Rebellion. Same thing with Virginia, the first anti-literacy law on the books writ large saying, including white people, you are not allowed to teach Black individuals, is 2 months before Nat Turner's Rebellion, right? So when you look at the timing of those slave code laws, they also coincide perfectly with Bray School students or their contemporaries being adults and being that legacy of educators. So some of the work you really have to pull out through archival silences, but I think the ongoing oral history and genealogy, as well as working with wider Atlantic communities who sided with the British and went to the Caribbean and Nova Scotia are going to be imperative.
That's actually going to be another question I
Yeah.
want to ask, is if you
So not yet, but we are actually now in conversation with that community, and they are sharing records with us, and we are going to be sharing records with them. Yeah.
Certainly for the question of the Nova Scotia connection, the Black Loyalists, we know, to put it in context, we know traditionally it's not the best way. It has been used historically that the history of Blacks in Canada has largely been written in terms of waves. With an important forward introduction preface that slavery existed in Canada prior to when these waves, like usually these waves are constructed in relation to, or in terms of those leaving the United States going to Canada. But we have to recognize that Canada had slavery. So people are being moved into a place that is a slave society. So the waves from 1783. So the Book of Negroes, the accounting of blacks who left through New York in 1783 to go to Nova Scotia. Many would go on and leave Canada ultimately. What are known as the United Empire Loyalists coming out of the War of 1812. We've got the self-emancipating freedom seekers coming particularly out of the 1850s. So putting that in that kind of broader context. And we certainly do look at the Williamsburg Bray School as part of a larger diaspora story. That has been how I have framed it from the beginning. Certainly acknowledging that it's also feeding into my own perspective and research past that is focused on Canada and the British Caribbean, as well as Black community history in the United States. So we look at this and we are actually at a point where we can begin to start actualizing that in terms of connections. With Atlantic Canada, we have other connections in higher ed and research in the Caribbean, as well as continuing to connect with scholars who are looking at the Bray schools in the colonial U.S. So other questions? I know there's other hands. I'm going to go to Selma, and then I'm going to come to you. Yes. Not Trinidad yet. We are kind of working through the Bermuda, Barbados, Bahamas kind of triad, if we could, from the Bray Associates records there most immediately, but certainly knowing the history of Trinidad and the larger British Empire work, I could see us ultimately working out to Trinidad as well. We'd have to look at Jamaica just by virtue of its importance in the British Caribbean as well. So right now we're kind of looking through that, but again, to the point of other modalities and other ways of thinking, definitely. But
you said 1812, and that's how those people
right.
to go to Trinidad.
Sure, right. So so part of this kind of focusing on the Bray School era, all right, so we have with the Bray Associates the other schools and then kind of building out over time. Yeah, so definitely, and I definitely think we want to kind of footnote that, file that. But definitely in the larger context of the British colonized Americas. Other questions? Yes. Right. So the term scholars we use the term scholars because in the Bray Associates records, they refer to the children as scholars. They don't refer to them as slaves or enslaved. They don't refer to them as students. They don't refer to them as children. They refer to them as scholars consistently. So we've been talking about and unpacking that term. There's a lot of things that we do know about how the school was structured. There's still a lot of questions we have about that. The financial records tell us different things about whether or not a fee was charged, for example. There was no indication that there was a charge to send students. Budget is an issue, but there is the money that the Bray Associates pledge for the operation of the school. The biggest chunk of that would be the securing the school and making sure that Ann Wager, the teacher, is paid. A lot of conversation is about the gap between what is needed to operate the school and how much the Bray Associates are actually pledging, and they draw a line in the sand at a certain point. We're not going to give you any more, and they raise in at least two different situations early on and then later on the question of subscription, which is we would understand as tuition or some kind of payment. In each case, that idea is struck down and it falls to, or otherwise the trustees just take it on themselves to make sure that the gap is filled, usually out of their own private funds. As far as the selection of students, there's some information in the Bray Associates correspondence about a vetting process of sorts, but that there are a lot of gaps around that, and I'm going to pass again back to Nicole as far as the second half of that answer.
Yeah. So And I would love if you guys want to add to this as well. The Bray School rules, I think, really highlight the idea of scholar versus survivor for these students. And I think there's a lot of work ongoing there, but when you look at households, it seems predominantly the implication in the records is that the enslavers get to select which enslaved students, which means that parental decision is completely excluded for those children. Interestingly, in the letter that corresponds, though, with that school rules, series of school rules, the trustee laments that if we could just isolate these children from their community, we would get complacency. But because we can't do that, I actually have an issue with the Black community and how they're seeing this school. So I think your point is a really valid one in the sense of they're trying in some ways to isolate these children, but they can't. And I think there are parallels. I think there are distinct differences between residential boarding schools and the Bray School. But if you want to sort of explore that idea more, I'd highly recommend reading, and all of this, again, is on the resource page, the school rules in conversation with the student list and the letter that all came together. Does that help?
And I'm wondering, Tonia, what oral history and what the descendant community can tell us.
Feedback from the descendant community about using the word scholar. I think that's a prideful term for them because if you look at the history of the 18th century Williamsburg, the female students, for example, were receiving an education that their white counterparts were not. White girls that age were not given a formal education. Boys around the age of 12 or 13, correct, went to William and Mary Grammar School, but the girls specifically that went to this school were receiving an education, a formal education. And so for the Black community, for descendants, the fact that the knowledge that our ancestors were likely some of the first scholars in the New World the term we don't have a problem with don't have a problem with that. We appreciate that they call them and refer to them as scholars.
And the term scholars does not denote the term scholars is, I think about a term that is really kind of place-based. It does not fundamentally address issues of survivorship. It doesn't address issues of survivorship or things kind of after the school. So there are other terms that can be used and so on, but I think scholar is very much a place-based, contextual term that does not preclude other terms that can be used. All right, Ms. Lassiter, correct? Yes, thank you.
We don't have it back to Elisha and Mary Jones, who attended the Bray School. We haven't been able to connect the two Jones family members on the Bray School list to parents or grandparents. We know that there's this gap between the 1760s attendance lists and the formation of the hot water tract in 1803. So I still need to close that gap. So I've been pulling all the Jones family names out of the Williamsburg tax list, James City County, York County, just trying to figure out who would have been the parents of these two children with the last name Jones in the attendance list, and connect them with the very, very many Joneses in that area. So if you have any information on where that's going to go, that would be brilliant. Okay. How many teachers at the Bray School? Just one, just Ann Wager. It's a good question. I'm going to turn that one over to Nicole.
Yeah. Great question. So it appears that she taught 7 days a week. In part because the Church of England doesn't really see, and actually the school rules are very illuminating to this. They're like, well, she's not working on Sunday, she's doing her Christian duty. And yet the most explicit rules for how her children are supposed to behave, how the scholars are supposed to behave at the school is on Sunday. However, there is a very interesting trend. I have not been able to definitively tie it down, but I am looking at it right now. And one of the things I see when you take all the scholars across all the Atlantic World schools, and let's say you put all their ages on a spreadsheet, right? We don't have all of them for the Bray School in Williamsburg, but we do for other schools. You see a very interesting trend. And what that trend is you tend to consistently see one young black girl who is much older than all of the other students in the classroom. We also,
When you say much older, can you just clarify what?
Yes, I can clarify. So that age ranges from anywhere from 10 to 19. You see it in Philadelphia. There's a 19-year-old girl at the school, and everyone else is like 6, 7, 8. Some schools, it's a little bit closer in age, where you have a 10-year-old with 3 and 4-year-olds. But you do see this trend consistently. You also know from their own rules later on in the early 19th century, they're using what is called the madras system. And the madras system is when you use older children in a classroom and break them into groups to teach younger children. So I'm still trying to learn more about how that fits into the Williamsburg Bray School, but I know in other Atlantic world Bray schools, in particular in the Bahamas, in Philadelphia, in New York, in other examples, you see those two trends consistently pop up. And I think that's something that needs to be studied and explored, quite frankly, more. This is a great question, and if I'm making kind of it's because I portray for Colonial Williamsburg the teacher, Ann Wager. So that's my other job when I'm not here.
In the room with us.
Yeah, well, no. I don't know. But what I will say consistently, what I've looked to try to understand her methodology are two things. It seems she was pro-slavery in her approach. And part of that is we know from the Bray Associates records, any teachers who did not fall, quote unquote, in line with their methodologies were immediately terminated and replaced. The Philadelphia Bray School in the 1760s is a perfect example. They say she's too New Light, she's too Presbyterian. She has getting ideas about her students. So we need to fire her and replace her with someone who will conform. What we also see, and I look consistently at the textbooks that are used at the school and repeat requested. But when it comes to the intricacies and the nuances of the day-to-day in that school, I think there's more that has to be explored. And I think also we have to look at how historical imagination, so pairing primary sources with common sense and mapping of a world, shaped that classroom. Because I have a lot of questions about it too. It seems she was pro-slavery and promoted a pro-slavery education, but she's in a very small space with 34 children who most likely have a very different opinion on their education than she does. It's also interesting, you see one final thing as a trend. All the Bray schools after the American Revolution until 1831 are run by black teachers. All of them prior to the American Revolution are run by white women. And I think that's a very interesting trend that we need to discuss with more detail.
All right. Quick question. This will have to be our last
Yes.
for right now, last formally.
Yeah, so usually it was the trustee of the school who was the minister for the local parish saying, I terminated this person, and they told the Bray Associates, and the Bray Associates said, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't have to report to the church anyway.
Technically, the minister was the representative for the Church of England in his community.
The Church of England was still funding?
Through the Bray Associates. So the Bray Associates are the third largest charity in the Church of England. Yeah.
So actually, we got time since I was short. Joanne, did you?
No, we're talking about the model of by the students. Older students were, thank you. You were discussing the model, and I don't know if this works, but whereby older students are teaching younger students, possibly. And I'm wondering if that's where we get this first generation of black educators in this particular type of training setting, because it's not, I wouldn't call it an apprenticeship, but indeed they are practicing these pedagogical skills. And so how are they using that beyond that particular space? Is this lending to a group of educators that will emerge out of that community?
I'm going to thank everyone. We started a few minutes late, so we get those few minutes back. Our next session is at 11. All sessions for Slate Seminar are in this room. Let me just also say, again, talking about your Slate Seminar packets, you have a postcard. You have a very lovely postcard in your packet that references the I Made This conference that the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation will be hosting next month in conjunction with their exhibition of the same name. There are the Strategic Cultural Partnerships / Bray School Lab has sponsored a certain number of slots at that conference. We are halfway there in terms of meeting our commitment. We are looking for, and we would love to sign up over the course of this conference. I would love that by end of day tomorrow that we have got all those slots filled. So November the 10th, that's a Friday, starting the afternoon, I think it's 3:30 start time. That evening there is going to be a magnificent event, a curated food and history event led by Michael Twitty. Yes, that alone is worth signing up for. So that evening, and then a slate of sessions on Saturday. We know that runs up until 5 o'clock. We know that runs into the time that the Let Freedom Ring Foundation Gala will start. If you have to leave a little bit early to get ready for the gala, I know we're bringing our clothes to work to just change and go over. We understand that, but we would love to have the opportunity for those who are local, those who are or can make themselves otherwise physically available to attend that free of charge. It is a $200 registration fee for the conference. Otherwise, we have pledged to cover the cost for a certain number of slots. We're at 50% right now. I can physically enter your information on my laptop with simple information, name, address, email, dietary restrictions, and mobility issues. Those are the questions. Once I have those, I can have you registered in 2 minutes. So we would love to, now that we are face-to-face with you, we would love to be able to register more people before we push this out finally more broadly on Monday. So thank you. Our next session is 11, and if you would like to join and be part of this, I made this conference next month, please let me know, and I can sign you up and get you confirmed. All right. Thank you for coming. Glad to see so many people in the room with us today, and we are just getting started. Thank you.